We're here to talk about Balloon Kid, and Daniel, what level will you cover?
I have chosen to do the first level.
All right. Where does this level take place?
Well, I presume it takes place in Pennsylvania, which is according to according to the manual and the story in the manual that we were reading, seems to be where the protagonist lives. And we can see that it is pencil themed by the pencil skyscrapers in the background. There's also matchsticks as well, maybe their apartments. And at the end of the level, the protagonist, Alice, will then move into a forest, and we can see that at the end of the level.
What are the enemies in this level?
So you've got the blackbirds, which move vertically. So you've got the vertical movement. You've got the albatrosses, which move horizontally. So you've got horizontal movement. You've got stationary enemies with the fire. You've got fire that walks. So you've got an enemy that moves horizontally along the ground. And you've got spikes, which are like an overhead enemy, and they're also stationary, but they hang from above. So through the combination of these different enemies, it covers quite a broad space of design.
Yeah, I never realized there's such a variety here.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it doesn't feel that way because they're quite predictable, right? So, actually, overall in this game, the enemies follow quite simple patterns that layer them together to create more sophisticated challenges. You've got the two little blackbirds, also the three blackbirds, which move up and down to a very limited range, and there's the fire, which is on that first island, and you've got the balloons, which are basically communicating to the player that they need to jump, and therefore that prompts the player into engaging with the core mechanic, and there's a bit of teaching involved in that way. And then you have to, once you jump up into the air, you then have to keep on jumping so as to float, and then through the way that these enemies and the balloons are arranged, it teaches you the idea of jumping and floating. Spikes are a bit interesting because it starts out and they're like, you can see them underneath the platform. It sort of plants the seed or establishes a context for their presence, for pre-teaching the spikes, and form fits function, so the spikes, look like spikes, and therefore that they're a threat that you should avoid. But the first time you see them, they're pretty hard to reach. And I actually tried before, but trying to get through the first two birds and then trying to, go underneath, you can't actually get underneath that first platform. But if you do, and you've got your balloons inflated, then as you try and walk through, it'll pop your balloon. So the only way to get underneath is to actually have no balloons, but if you've got no balloons, then you can't actually fly underneath the platform. So again, it's sort of reinforcing player behavior. The balloons are sort of organized in this sine wave pattern, and we see that balloons in Balloon Kid function more like the bananas in Donkey Kong Country as opposed to the coins in Super Mario Brothers. So they're there to communicate the most efficient path through the level, and in this initial level the balloons are placed quite close up together, so there's more density, and therefore they really reinforce their function in this way. So if we see, in the first, from the house at the start to the first foregrounded little skyscraper, the first 6 balloons are pretty evenly spaced. There's a slight gap, and then the next 6 after that are pretty much the same distance apart, so they're quite consistent. And generally, the arc fits in well with the general way in which the avatar moves. And if we follow, the sine wave of balloons, we quickly come across the next set of spikes, which are on the ceiling. And just by collecting the balloons, the player will bring them into camera view. So we'll bring the spikes into camera view, but they'll also, they should be relatively far away from them. And, there's plenty of platforms here that even if the player, touches those spikes, then it's only going to damage their balloon, and they've got plenty of runway to then, blow up another balloon. And I suppose sort of that's what some of these longer platformed areas are for, right? Like they're sort of there so that if you need to, you've got the option of inflating a balloon. And I'm not sure about you guys, but the first time I had to inflate a balloon, it's like I pushed down once and then it started inflating, and then I kind of like walked and then it didn't inflate. So it actually took me like a minute to figure out that I have to keep on pressing down until the balloon is fully inflated. And so I suppose on the runway here, it does allow the player enough time to figure that out. So, and you've got the, what's that called, the little Game Boy there, where you can go into the bonus area. And I suppose, we could argue and say that it is a bit confusing that they have a picture of a Game Boy. On the Game Boy, I suppose, symbolises a game, and it's a bonus game, although you're already in a game, so there's that element too. It's very, there's a lot of subtext in this game.
And later levels, the bonus games will be, more out of the way. In this first level, it's just right out there in the open.
There's an arrow pointing you to it.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to miss.
And then we have this long row of spikes and a host of enemies, which encourage on the player to drop back onto the floor. And I suppose the idea is that the way the balloons and the enemies are set up, that it kind of encourages on the player to go back to walking along the floor, and so it sort of suggests this idea of there is an element where you have to float in the sky and avoid enemies, but you can also walk along on the ground as well. That's another way that you can traverse these levels, and that the gameplay is a bit of both. On the other hand, just as you get into this area, you can also get the P balloon, which will make you invincible, which turns this whole string of enemies into targets that you can then run into, sort of similar to like Pac-Man, when you eat a Pac pellet and then you can then eat your enemies. It's the same kind of idea. In terms of the player's exposure to the water, because the water is also its own hazard, it could be counted as an enemy. It's not really until after that long stretch where you have an extended stretch of open space where there's no platforms. And that's really the only area in this level where you actually have to make it through there without getting your balloons popped. Those two little albatrosses that are moving horizontally there, so players could move up. If the players move up, then they're in a position to just fall into the gap. So to fall on towards where the three balloons are. On the other hand, if they're not, they're in a position where they have to quickly move up past on the first building so that they don't get crushed by the screen scroll, which is interesting as well. If a player wanted to, could they fly on top and avoid the heart?
It looks pretty tight.
Yeah, I'm going to try that out right now, because as you say, Greg, it looks pretty tight because there's the fire there. So I suppose with the timing, it would seem that you'd have to wait for the albatross to go past. It's pretty hard because on the way that the screen scrolls, if you want to avoid the timing of the albatross, you have to be sort of, where the two balloons are, like on the first two balloons in that section are, but then the screen's scrolling. Okay, yeah, so it is possible to not get your balloon popped by the albatross, but it would seem that it's pretty hard to get past the fire without touching it, and it's an instant death there, simply because there's such a narrow spacing there. Yeah.
If you let go of the balloons, you can actually just stand right on top of enemies, and they won't hurt you. And you can actually think you can get through the entire first level almost without using the balloons at all. So that's a pretty neat challenge that you can impose on yourself, is to see how much of the game you can get through using minimal balloon jumps.
And then at the end, we have this like a long platform and some walking enemies, and I suppose on the focus of this area is the timing of the enemies on the floor, and that you've got the albatross enemy hidden among the balloons there. So the player does have two options. They can go above or beneath the bird, and although it doesn't look terribly threatening, the actual arrangement of the albatrosses and of the fire, they're positioned to limit the player's options. Those paths that you can travel through aren't so clear, and that's one of the core challenges of Balloon Kid, is being able to look at an arrangement of enemies and to be able to figure out the path forward and actually factor in your own timing, so Alice's own timing, and the momentum and whatnot, as well as on the timing of the elements around her and the screen scrolling to see opening paths. And where that's relatively simple at the start, it becomes more complicated by the end.
I feel like this stage is paced by the big long platforms, and you'll get little moments of reprieve with small floating platforms, but you're mostly moving from one bridge to the next, except for that one area towards the end where you have a long stretch over the sea. It strikes me as interesting that the ground enemies are the ones that can kill you, whereas the airborne enemies all just bounce you.
Yeah, they bounce you or they pop your balloon.
And that feels appropriate because it's going to be the ground-based enemies are probably easier to avoid. Whereas flying is kind of hard in this game, so getting around the enemies is more difficult. The bird enemies is more difficult.
Yeah, so there's more flexibility in terms of landing on top of them or bumping into them. So something that I talked about in the Warrior book is the idea of enemy power and how in different contexts, based on the mechanics that Warrior has, the enemies, their abilities and their patterns, movement, trajectory, AI, those things are balanced so that the power of the enemies is generally consistent relative to the player's abilities, and that's the same thing that's going on here, I think.
How do you mean?
Well, I suppose the general idea, right, is that it's harder on the fly. So the enemies that are in the air have less of a punishment to them in the fact that you can run into them, you can jump on them, and they only pop your balloons, but they don't kill you. So on the enemy and the punishment of hitting or making contact with the enemy fits the player's mechanics, whereas on the ground, where the control is much more simple, touching on the enemies has a bigger punishment or a bigger consequence. And so those things are relatively balanced. Probably one of the more difficult challenges in Balloon Kid, which is the idea of your balloon is also part of the hitbox. Yeah, I'm not sure about you guys, but that's something I found quite hard to judge. Often when I'm playing, I'm thinking about where Alice, where the avatar is, and secondary is the balloon. And so sometimes there's a tendency to misjudge when the balloon is going to hit a target.
That's actually an interesting property that's unique to the Balloon Fight series, where your real health bar is actually your balloons. So you can actually just ram into enemies with your main body and you'll rebound. The main hitbox you want to avoid having touched isn't even your main body, it's the balloons.
It's interesting how there's that difference.